Welcome in, everybody, to this episode of Discard for Magic, a Summoner Wars podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm the other host, James, or Jexic, and today we're overjoyed to have Orange Lazarus here to talk about polar dwarves and some other topics.
Hey, thanks, guys. Good to be here. Hopefully overjoyed. Hopefully I can live up to that.
Some of the people in the community may know, but some may not. Orange Lazarus, you're one of the longest standing players in the community from all the way back from first edition. So why don't you just give them a little insight into how you found Summoner Wars and your time playing it?
Yeah, sure. I used to live in Boston. I relocated to Pennsylvania, but back when I lived in Boston, I worked with a guy who actually he's in the league. He's been in the league for a while, but I worked with him. He introduced me to the game. We played the physical game a couple times, and at that time there's the Plaid Hat app, and I had a train ride into work and out of work every day. So I'd get on the train usually in the mornings and the evenings and just play a little Summoner Wars on my phone, and that's how I learned about the game. So it started off pretty slow, where I just played here and there, but slowly started to gather some momentum.
Yeah, I remember playing against you, and I was like, "Who's this guy who doesn't have this many games, and why does he keep beating me?" And that would explain it. You basically just played on your train ride, and that was it.
Yeah, I didn't play a ton back then. Although, it's funny. I was much more kind of casual, and I'm only smiling about this story. I remember because you had Water D on the podcast recently. So my buddy was like, "Hey, there's this message board where people are talking about the game, and there's this tournament you should sign up for." And so I signed up for the tournament, and he's like, "There's this guy Water D who says that nobody can beat him if he turtles with," I think it was like Phoenix Elves, or it was someone. He was like, "You can't beat him when he turtles." And I was like matched up with him, and I was like, I've always been a guy who kind of likes a challenge, and I was like, I want to beat this guy, And I think I beat him in the tournament with like Tundra Orcs, who they were a pretty strong faction in 1E. And at that point in time, I was new, and Water D was probably better than me. There was probably a good amount of luck there, but I think that's when I kind of switched from like, I'll just play, on a train when I have a little bit of time, to starting to like ramp up a little bit more to say, hey, I want to kind of dig into this game a little bit more.
So there's a history.
The rivalry we didn't know we had.
I wasn't super active I'm not like super active on Discord or anything, but I don't know. I feel like the Snaug and the Jay Yoders, they were like the real champions of 1E. I was kind of maybe in the mix a little bit, but it was still one of my favorite games, But then I think once I moved from Boston, I kind of dropped out and stopped playing as much until the second edition came out, and I picked that up, and I haven't stopped since. So
big names that I remembered from first edition were like Snaug and Your Name, and I remember of a tournament in which I thought the Fallen Kingdom in first edition, the original summoner Ritalis, was dreadful, and his win percentage wasn't great. But I remember, I think it was H37, who plays a little bit in second edition also, took the Fallen Kingdom only through the entire tournament and ended up almost winning. Lost to Snaug, I think, in the finals, and they were just like possessing people with the phantoms and stuff and doing all sorts of crazy plays. And there was some decent amount of luck in their run, but they had an incredible run with one of the worst factions. Back then, the tournaments were a little different. You could pick, like, the top win rate factions, you could only pick once, but any of the lower win rate factions, you could pick as many as you wanted. And you took, like, 5 faction matchups, so.
I remember that run, but I never did that great in those tournaments either. And then there was also like Nadir 99 was really big in terms of the sheer amounts of games played. He's present in 2E, but I don't see him too often. And then there was that guy Ad Hoc who had like a top 50 players list, and I haven't seen him play 2E yet, but
Aaron, I remember that run that H37. I mean, the Phantoms with Possess, though. I mean, that would just completely change a game if you possessed
like Krung.
I think he got Krung at one point, and I was like, oh my goodness.
I thought the most impressive when Snaug won a tournament with like Vlox, like the whole thing. And again, the Vlox wasn't by any stretch, I feel like a dominant 1E summoner, and he just would like flex and win tournaments. And he's so humble. He said, just good luck," but no, he knew what he was doing, and he knew how to play that well.
Well, he used to always pick the lower tier stuff. People were like, oh, these are the big four, and then Snog would specifically not take any of those in the tournament, and then. But even now, it was funny. I played against him on the Scuffle, and he was saying like he doesn't even know what his record is in the tournaments. He just plays, and when the games pop up, like he doesn't know his position in the bracket. He's just like, yeah, whatever, I'll just play.
I love it.
I feel like that's always how he has been. Like when we were talking to him after like one of the showdowns way back when, he was like, "Yeah, I just like play as I like see the turns come up. I don't really like think about him a whole lot. I don't take a lot of time on him. I just play," which is he's a wild for that, and also phenomenal player. But a faction that took some bits from several factions from first edition, the Polar Dwarves, is one of the factions that you are phenomenal with. Orange Lazarus, one of many. Why don't you give us a little insight into the Polar Dwarves and just some starting tips for people?
Even my history with Polar Dwarves is there was a point where I didn't play Polar Dwarves just because I felt that they were, not fun. And before some of their changes, when you won as them or lost as them, usually it involved like a double ice ram bouncing around the summoner, and it felt like a faction that went against the grain of the game and what it was trying to do. And so there was just a while where even if I had to play them in the league, I would do my best to try and win without using ice ram or on the summoner, that kind of thing, because it just didn't. I didn't like how, even though I like the theme of the faction, I didn't like the main strategy to win with them. And but I think after they made the changes, notably the not stacking of the ice ram and not being able to use the ice ram on summoners, I came back to the faction and started playing it a lot more, and I felt like, hey, it's not. I don't even think it's an S tier faction anymore. I think it's probably a solid A or maybe a B faction, but now it's I have a lot more fun playing it because the main strategy isn't just ram shift the summoner and win. You have to kind of think about how you play Polar Dwarfs differently, and I think the more I've gotten into it, I feel like there's a lot of different ways you can play the faction and have fun and be fairly successful. So one of my main tips for Polar Dwarfs, but I mean I guess it goes to any faction, is like first understand the matchup, because I think a lot of people just get in and they start doing the same thing and they pull back and maybe set up a Frost Mage and start firing. But I think you can, if you understand the faction you're playing, that can help kind of decide how you want to start cultivating a hand or positioning your deck to be successful. So another like tip I'd say right off the bat is often like get your starting formation and start building some magic, because I think Polar Dwarves is a faction that you don't have to like right out the gate get a bunch of units out to like set some kind of dominant forward position. You can take your time and kind of figure out what your hand's going to be and what your opponent's going to do, and take that time all's on the first turn. I'm usually just maybe moving around the formation and taking a shot with the Frost Mage, but I'm not trying to get a lot of units out, because understanding what your initial hand is and building some magic so you have some options seems really important with Polar Dwarves to me.
Yeah, good point. Because I mean, like they do have good champions too, and they, aside from Nadiana, the two of them cost 5. Seems like getting to that 5 so you're ready if you draw the champion seems like a good step.
Definitely. And I think, like, again, as I was thinking about this, before I came on podcast, I was like driving in, here to work, and I was thinking, what are the different ways I tend to play? And I came up with like 5 different ways I think you can play Polar Dwarves. And the first one is the main one that everybody knows, like the get out ice golems and put yourself in a position to do a ram shift or just kind of position golems to kind of wreak havoc on. And like, I think that's always a good starting point. Like getting ice golems on the board allows you to say, okay, well, if I want to ram shift, I can do that. If I want to absorb some damage and then ice repair, I can do that. If I want to get a champ out that utilizes my ice golems, then I can do that. So it's like getting some magic, getting ice golems on the board allows you to do a lot, but that first style really focuses around them. I think like there's a second style of playing, which is like the clog, which again, a lot of people know that one too, where you kind of get to the middle of the board, move all your, whether it's ice golems, parapets, gates up, you kind of clog the middle of the board, and then you get out someone like a Jarmond, and if people are near those gates, your units are going to get hurt. That's like another pretty common one. But then I think there's also like an interesting range game you can play with polar dwarves, just because those frost mages, if you play a faction that has to come to you, which there are several, whether it's cave goblins or obsidian dwarves or even fallen kingdom, like where factions kind of have to come to you to be successful, you can set up a pretty mean base of range that is going to be hard for people to penetrate, especially if you get parapets out. I mean, the fourth one that I have started enjoying more is like kind of the aggro way to play them, where you instead of using glacial shifts to move around ice rams, you use glacial shifts to like get your gates surrounding, your opponent's gates are on their side. One game against your fungal dwarves, Aaron, I think I did that pretty well.
Yeah.
That game's been shared so many times, I think.
It's a brutal game. If anybody hasn't seen it, I can share it again. It is one of the, and this was before the changes, I believe. Like Fungal Dwarves was still, I think, timing hadn't been changed, and Cooldeck definitely didn't have one less HP. Orange Lazarus just gets up in my face from turn one, blocks off my starting gate with a Frost Mage.
Yeah, the Frost Mage play was what stuck out to me, because he's using these 1/4 Frost Mages just as gate blockers, and I was like, what is going on?
And then I had no reply. Like, there was nothing that I could do. I didn't draw any gates, I don't think, and I was just like, I have one side to attack any unit he shows me, and it's not enough because I can't infect anything, I can't convert anything, like I can't. Coldex just starts taking massive damage, and I'm like, ah.
And I mean that game, in some ways, I'm glad it's gotten shared a little bit, because I just feel like hopefully it changes the mindset, because before the changes for polar dwarves, you'd never do that because it's just so much more advantageous to sit back, wait for a ram shift, do that. You just wouldn't want to take those chances. Where now, I think it's taking some of those aggressive moves, like A, it can be fun, but B, it can be viable if you do it the right way against some powerful factions like that. So I'm kind of glad that's in the repertoire in a more viable way than it used to be.
I was gonna say, he said there was a fifth way, but you can.
Well, I think the fifth way is like, and I don't play this way as much, but I've seen some folks do it more. I think Water D does a little bit more, where you use a lot of ice smiths and bears. Like you really use the bear a lot more to kind of, and you get ice smiths out, you put boost on them, and you just threaten the frost axe like multiplication. Usually on the bear, I guess you can do it on ice golems too. Like do stuff like ram your bear up into enemy territory and assassinate or kind of take out champs with the ice golem with the frost axe. So I think I don't do that quite as much, but I've seen people be very successful by kind of tossing that around too. So
Yeah, no, that's I think Adamant 3 run likes to do that.
Adamant does that a lot. He claims that's the only way that he uses them, and it works well for him.
So I think like what used to be a pretty one-dimensional faction is like, I think there's like a decent amount of depth to Polar Dwarves that, if hopefully if some people hear this podcast and think, oh yeah, I could play that a little differently, like it might kind of make the faction, because the faction's not really highly picked with tournaments. I don't think. I think people are still kind of off Polar Dwarves a little bit, but I think since I've come back, I've felt like since I've come back to the faction, more fun to play with some of these different options.
I agree. I came back to them after they got nerfed too, just to check them out, and they've been. I'm still not the greatest with them, but I do find them to be a fun and dynamic sort of play.
I really enjoy them also. I've taken them in several tournaments, and I've done pretty well with them. I think they're still a pretty strong faction. I don't think they're like top 3 or anything, but we can get into that later. But I think they're still fairly strong. But I'm glad the changes happened, because I don't know if you guys remember the game I had against Donkey. when I was Savannah Elves.
Savannah Elves, yeah.
That was the strongest play I think I've ever felt that I've had against Donkey, and I beat Donkey a couple of times, but I felt so strong in that game. I had like 3 or 4 lionesses at like full boost, almost full health, like everything's in massive health. I think I had a rhino out there too, all in my front lines, and Abu was like second or third behind them, and Donkey just rammed them out of the way and then did a massive ram to murder Abu at like 8 or 9 health, and I was just like, oh my goodness.
And it was from like long range too, because he was like
Yep.
shifting guys into golems to pop them and make them move and do more shifts and just like no,
Double glacial shifted, and it was just eh, still haunts me to this day.
Oh, I've had a couple of them too, and I hear you. I mean, it's like the change now just feels like it. You know, yeah, you might ice ram like a champ, but it's never going to just end the game. And you know, there's always a cost to do that from Polar Dwarves now, and now the cost seems a little bit more in line with the reward versus like just game ending.
And yeah, for those of you at home who don't necessarily have the newest version, basically what it changes is you can no longer shift summoners, or you can no longer ram summoners or enemy structures, because that was a big thing with like sand goblins and potentially when the forged come out too, where like you could just start a chain of shifting your opponent's stuff, and it would just that was pretty broken too.
Yeah, I remember people when Sand Goblins would play against them, they would just send Krusk and then continually bounce him off of things to continually bounce more things. And
You want to talk about your champion play and how that might be determined by different
Yeah,
matchups and
sure.
stuff?
So champions, I played champions probably a little less than average. Now, don't get me wrong, I'll still get champs out. I mean, there was a time where probably like a lot of folks, I got Jarmaned out much more than the others, but I think that's balanced out a little more recently for me. And I mean, I think there are certainly some factions that can play around Jarman because they don't have to be crowding gates or they have range. I mean, if you get melee factions, Jarman can be obviously more, uh, more potent because melee factions have to be, up in your face, engaging with gates, and Jarman can be behind a parapet and can kind of do a lot of damage. But I think there are some times where, again, if you're playing more of a range game and your opponent has to come to you, Nadiana can be pretty powerful. Rather than just like a frost mage, Nadiana can be a little more mobile and not have to be adjacent to gates and have some good pop. And then Olag I think has if you're playing the ice golem heavy game and you have some ice repairs and you got Olag out there, man, making those ice golems 6 health and then having Olag out there with his melee can kind of be a nice way to kind of engage kind of midfield. So I think it kind of depends who the opponent is and how it's playing, but that's kind of how I split them out. But I'd say probably 50% of my games with Polar Dwarves, I don't summon a champ because I'm just kind of in a groove with ice golems and the commons and kind of feel like the games lends itself to maybe just kind of maximizing the commons and playing, kind of getting into an econ battle when you have a good ram shift turn, you're using frost mages effectively. Oftentimes I'll just keep that going and discard the champs. So, but I might be a little unique in that. I know other people play champs like almost all the time when they play Polar Dwarfs.
Part of the reason for that is that the 3 champs they have are all like pretty good and pretty viable. I know a mistake that I used to make a lot with Olag is like I would bring him into play and I'd be like, all right, he's gonna increase everything, but I'd keep him in like the front lines and then he'd die in like a turn or two. Even if he was like fairly protected, they would just target him. And so I found that I personally like will now just start him in the back, and like if I have to bring him up to help, I'll bring him up to help, but I'm just gonna keep him for his value and just like, especially if I can get him out early.
It's not a bad play at all because if Olog's in the back and you have some ice golems that are at 6 health and they have to ping them, and then you put a couple ice repairs out, it's just that can give you such an econ boost, and Olog's not even doing anything. He's just beefing up those structures to allow for just waste your enemy's attack. Not a waste, but it just absorbs a lot of attack value, and then you can kind of on the other side take out units and get ahead on econ. So that's a good tip to use Olag in that way and not feel like you gotta have him way out up in front.
and then I bring him out as like the end game guy when I need him to try and finish people off, because I feel like Polar Dwarves, more than most factions, will go to like a very close end game of like Savara's there and maybe a unit or two, and then there's the opponent summoner and a unit or two, and you're just coming down to that last little fight.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to bring up too. Is like, just are there any creative uses you found for Svara's ability? I don't like the ability to shift a structure or force a structure seems very unique in the game.
Something I do with Savara, I don't know if this perfectly answers the question, but I tend to get Savara involved a little earlier, often even in that first turn. Like I said, often in the first turn, I'm not necessarily summoning units, I'm just positioning the Frost Mage, but oftentimes, if depending on what my opponent's done, I'll take a shot with the Frost Mage, but put Savara out there to take a shot because you can use her ability to cover her up. Kind of with Krusk and Thrust, but with Savara, you just, whether it's a parapet or a gate or an ice golem, you can take some damage early on and kind of lure your opponent into overextending to attack your summoner. And then just cover her up and put a bunch of stuff in front of her. And for a lot of factions, they have to bust through a parapet before they can kind of get any more shots at her. So I think, that's maybe one way that people can get more creative with using her ability is to just take some damage early and then cover her up. And then, your opponent's been more focused on damaging Savara than actually like taking out your commons, and you can kind of start getting a good set of either get a champ out or kind of advance in on the board. Or I don't know if that answers your question, but that's at least one way that I think I use her a little bit differently than some.
I think that's good advice. I've definitely lost games against Polar Dwarves, like trying to go for her, and then like between being able to summon ice golems in the build phase or extra parapets or gates, like they have more ways to protect her once she gets a little bit down. If your opponent does commit in that way.
And I think a lot of folks who maybe use Polar Dwarves and maybe aren't as experienced kind of get caught in the trap of like only using parapets for Savara. But if your opponent knows that they'll just park, 3 away, put a range unit away from the parapet. And it's really hard to still get another shot in with Savara because you can't move the parapet and then move up behind it. So I think like you got to be careful on how you use the parapets, and often maybe maximize them with some other units. Or if Savara is more kind of further up midfield or beyond, then you can kind of put her right behind a parapet. So maybe that's another tip is I think people often like play the parapets immediately because they want to get them on the board. But if you can advance a little bit and get the parapet a little further up, that can make it a lot harder for people to just dodge the parapet or sit back on it. So, sometimes just holding that until you have the right position versus just plopping it on the third row, and then you can't really, you're spending a lot of time trying to advance it. So
when units that you find that you're like always playing or you play like every copy of, or ones that you don't play as much?
Number one discard is gates. And again, I mean, some people maybe that's obvious, but I see a lot of people who play a lot of gates for Polar Dwarves, and part of me is like, you have ice golems, which are gates. Every time you discard a gate, you're just building more magic that you can do a lot of damage with otherwise. So I almost always discard my gates. Now, there are some times where you want to use a gate strategically and you put one down, but I discard almost all my gates and just use ice golems and try and keep them safe or repair them and summon off of those. I mean, parapets, I'm never discarding them. I play almost every ice golem every game, and Glacial Shift, I think I prioritize that ahead of Ice Ram because like Glacial Shift, again, you not only can use that for Ram, but you can use that to position gates. I mean, if you get a 10 health gate, all of a sudden, like up against your opponent's gate on their side, that's pretty powerful. And so I always want to use Glacial Shift one way or another. Even if I'm not drawing an Ice Ram, I'll use that to position gates forward if the matchup calls for that.
So like after the change, will you hold on to a shift if you see an ice ram, or will you kind of like wait for the combo? I mean, if you don't see the ice ram, you know what I'm saying? Like if you just get your glacial shift early, but you have a good spot to put the 10 gate, do you think you'll just shift early?
I will. I mean,
but not always.
Yeah, it's all right, but I'd say I'm willing to do that. Like, whereas before, I'd never, I would just never play a shift until I got the ram. But now I think, yeah, if you get a shift early and there's that opportunity, I'd take it. if you're holding on to that one shift, and then you can clog your hand pretty quick if you're just like waiting for that perfect time. So if you can use that shift and get your units up there and kind of take advantage of it, I would.
What about repair? I feel like ice repair is like it's not the ugly stepchild, but I feel like it's the one that people tend not to play as much or will discard often. Is that the case for your play?
Sometimes you can get a lot of value out of ice repair. Like again, especially if the early game you're getting people to take shots at your summoner and take shots at your parapets and your ice golems, and then you have a way to pull them back and put a frost mage in front of the ice golem, and then eventually, if you have 2 or 3, obviously, ice golems that you can repair and get a lot of value out of a 0-cost ice repair, that's great. But to your point, I think if it's not there, if I draw it and I don't immediately have that option, I'm usually going to build that because, again, opening up another ice golem in my hand or building magic for a champ, I think offers a lot more value than trying to hang on and try and generate value out of a event you happen to draw. So I'd say probably 60 to 70% of the time, I'm going to discard them unless I see a real kind of viable way to get good value out of it.
Do you ever use them like on a turn when you have ram shift as well, and just kind of like use it to like you can force a golem and then force it to get extra distance, and then it takes a little damage and then you can heal it off? You ever do that trick, or is it kind of like too niche to really even talk about much?
No, that's legit. I mean, I've certainly done that, and I think especially if to really get that extra kind of bit of position, you want to kind of hit them off each other. Again, I feel like some of that frequency has gone down now that there's not such a high emphasis on the ram shift. But yeah, there are definitely situations where like hanging them against each other to get them further up or gets those extra hits and then just repairing them is certainly a good move if you can do it. But often that's like if you have 3 events in your hand, at that point, the ram, the shift, and the repair, like it's a little more rare to have that many events just in hand ready to go.
Yeah, definitely don't like hold for that, but if you happen to fall into it, then maybe, yeah.
It is a unique deck when I look at it because to me there isn't, other than gates, there's not like anything that I just auto discard, because even ice smiths, like, yeah, you can use them for the frost axe, but sometimes it's nice to have a 0 cost that you can just with 2 melee to just move up, take a shot at someone and be a distraction and not take away from some of the magic you're trying to build for other things. So even I think ice smiths can be valuable.
And they're just like a threat, you get them out there and they've got a boost, and suddenly your opponent thinks, well, I got to kill that or else I might die to a bear, So then it's just a good distraction.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the unique things about the Polar Dwarves deck is that they have that range of costs. None of their commons cost the same amount of magic, so they kind of all have a use. And if you kind of build to 4 or 5 magic, it gives you an opportunity to play a variety of different sorts of costed units on your
I completely agree with that. Having a nice pool of magic to give you those options, like, yes, it helps to actually play those options, but it also helps because your opponent has to consider, like, okay, well, they could get out 2 bears and do some serious damage, like trample and damage people pretty quick if you've got 6 magic, or you can get out, a solid champ and another common. It's like that. You can do a lot with like a certain amount of magic. So it's another reason to just kind of try and get that magic built up early to give you those options and keep your opponent at bay a little bit.
But you'd say the number 1 card to discard is most likely just your extra gates.
Yep, extra gates, and if you get a bear in the first like turn or 2, I usually discard it because I'm not positioned yet far enough up the board to utilize a bear well, and getting 3 costs right away on a common, like I just don't think is the best value. So early bears and gates like are pretty much the only auto discards, and then after that, like everything's in play.
Although, like you said, you made it sound like champions are pretty high on the discard list too, at least the way you typically play if you don't have the magic for them now.
Do you find that you play most of your bears? Because I feel like that's one of the units that I tend to discard. I tend to only play like 1 or 2 just because of the cost. Do you play like majority of your bears, especially if you get them later?
I think on a typical game, I'll play 1 to 2 bears. And some games you'll play 0. If you got a lot more range going on and you can't really do a lot with the trample, it's like, well, and you're not really getting ice smiths involved, sometimes I'll discard them all. But I'd say on a typical game, it's 1 to 2 bears. But I don't play that heavy bear style, so I don't mind discarding them and not necessarily having them a core part of the strategy.
What do you think are like some of their best matchups? If someone's just starting out trying to play the Polar Dwarves, what would give them like a decent edge to help them get that footing for their first games?
There was a time where Phoenix Elves was just so impossible. I mean, that's gotten a little better because you can't just ram commons away from Maltaria, but still, as it's been kind of talked about, they just have such a hard time taking out gates and parapets with, since a lot of their auto damage tools don't do anything. So there's definitely Phoenix Elves, but I think Eternal Council's not too bad a matchup because they typically she's not doing anything with the events, and so a lot of that learn threat isn't there quite as much. I don't think I mean, I play Fallen Kingdom a lot. I don't think it's too Fallen Kingdom. That's a good matchup to get your range work in because their carriers can't infect too much very easily. You just throw away the Ice Smiths, and a lot of the other commons are beefy enough that they're not susceptible to a lot of carrier spam. I think Cave Goblins, we know it's like it's tough if you get a big fortress set up. It's hard for the Cave Goblins to penetrate, especially if they don't have like a great first turn. So I think those are probably some of the best matchups for Polar Dwarves. I haven't played a lot of Wayfarers against them, but I mean, you can pretty easily deny the Seek the Horizon for Wayfarers, but it is a little interesting because they can get on your side of the board and really boost up Summoner's ability on Wayfarers. So I don't know if you guys have a take on Wayfarers against Polar Dwarves.
I was thinking about Wayfarers. I think when I first started playing Wayfarers versus Polar Dwarves, I thought it was Wayfarers' favor just because Svara doesn't have good answers to a summoner right in her face anymore without the Ice Ram threat. But at the same time, if Svara just kind of like shifts back and is able to get some extra structures down, you can deny those diagonals. And this might be one of those matchups where you'll actually play at least one or two of your normal gates,
right,
just to like wall off an area so you can't get through those diagonals. I'd probably say it's like maybe 55 Polar Dwarves favor, but I don't know. I'd have to play a bunch of games of the matchup to really know. But I'd say it's probably a good one to work on. And also just getting used to defensive play against Wayfarers, I think.
You guys think I missed any?
Vanguards is probably not an easy one for them to approach the Polar
that's
Dwarves.
true.
That was the only one that came to mind. Fallen Kingdom, I play a lot of Fallen Kingdom, and I hate playing Polar Dwarves as Fallen Kingdom. That might be my least favorite matchup to play as them. It's just so tough to advance if they play that rage game, and you can't trade because archers and cultists are not going to get you the damage for the value that you need. It's so tough.
Yep, I'm right there with you.
And it's not like you can infect a parapet, It's
That's Fallen Kingdom. I have best success if I get a loot out. You start one-shotting parapets and like ice golems. That really helps, but still, that's like often an easy task with when you're getting kind of pinged and hit from range and struggling to make your way up the board.
Yeah, that's one of the big reasons that I stopped taking Fallen Kingdom in like tournaments and competitive plays because that matchup is so tough. That and the Savannah Elves are the two matchups that I can't seem to overcome against competitive players. But what about the toughest matchups for Polar Dwarves? What are the ones that you think they struggle with the most?
Shadow Elves. I mean, Pulse can really be deadly against Polar Dwarves. So I think Shadow Elves and what they can do where. Shadow Elves are tough against a lot of factions, but I think with Polar Dwarves, they can kind of force Polar Dwarves to come to them a little bit more sometimes, and just have a lot of tools to hit gates or ice golems and then move away from them, and so I think Shadow Elves is pretty tough. I think the change has made Sand Goblins much better, and the mortar can be kind of pretty deadly, and then using thrust to again make get some attacks in and then get back. And it's just hard for ice golems to kind of keep up or keep pace with that. So that's an interesting one that's changed since the nerf. I think Sky Spear Avians moving around. A really good Avians player can just keep moving around and make it really hard to kind of get a good formation going. I think Cloaks Cloaks are, again, good against a lot of people with just Moto boots with the same type of idea. I haven't played High Elves, I think maybe once or twice against Polar Dwarves, but again, High Elves, I think, is one of those that we're still discovering a little bit, but they're good against quite a lot of factions. So, I mean, maybe that's my short list there.
Yeah, that was one that came up in the big tournament between Waterdeep and Prophet, but Waterdeep said he hadn't played against High Elves in general as much at that point, but that was one of the more lopsided games of that final. I might also, just anecdotally speaking, say that Tundra Orcs can be good against the Polar Dwarves.
Yeah, I think that matchup, Tundra Orcs and Polar Dwarves, is pretty 50-50. It's one that's Tundra Orcs got the tools to get up and deal the damage, but they also have to be in your face, so Polar Dwarves can punish a little bit. But
I think it depends on a bit just like how hot they go. But I also like found like Freeze is like ironically very good against ice golems. You know, because you just free because you're if you're counting on that to be your gate or your summoning spot, and then you just freeze it, and then it's like, oh well, I can't use it now for a turn.
Another one I think they struggle with potentially is Swamp Orcs, but we probably haven't seen a ton of that. But Mug can just destroy 5 health parapets and stuff like no other.
Yeah, I could see that, and especially a Mug that again stays back, and you try and advance against them, and the folks who will put Mug out there early to try and use regenerate and build the commons up. You try and advance against Mug. Mug will take out a golem or a parapet before they retreat. I mean, yeah, you're right. That swamp orc could be a tricky one too. I haven't played a ton of that either. Yeah, so I mean, again, you're right. It's like trying to play Mug before the nerf, where you could just ram shift the summoner would totally take that off the table. But it's interesting that you'd have to play around that now and figure out how to advance on Mug without just losing everything.
Yeah, I haven't played a lot of that matchup either, but I think thinking about it even more now, like it might be Polar Dwarves one of their worst matchups because they don't have unless you get a bear with like an ice smith under it, they don't have a way to deal a lot of big damage, and so Mug can also just like regenerate pretty easily and pretty safely.
It would be hard to get up the board fast to because I think good thing against Mug is to take out the commons early, and a faction can kind of get up there quick and do that and prevent the big swarm of commons is key, and it takes a while for Polar Dwarves to get up there. So yeah, you're right. That could be a tough one.
Like common mistakes you see people making against like Polar Dwarves?
Against them or playing as them?
Both. Playing against them or playing as them.
Yeah, I think playing as them, I think I see, as I was mentioning, I think players put down gates and try and establish a position too soon. Because once you establish that position with gates, especially, then it's hard to move all of that, to a different position if your opponent just kind of shifts in a different part of the board, and then you're kind of stuck with this big maze. So rather than putting down gates and a lot of commons early, kind of figure stuff out, like I said, build up your kind of possibilities. And then, I guess hand in hand with that mistake is like only forcing, not really understanding the different ways to play Polar Dwarves, and then getting kind of stuck in the one way of playing them and not being able to adjust. So as against them, I think like it's tough based on the different matchups, but like feeling like you have to hit them head on, and as soon as a parapet comes out, you got to like do everything you can to swarm that parapet and take it out. Like, yes, sometimes that's the case, but I just think you have a whole lot more. Sometimes your positioning against Polar Dwarfs is as important, if not more important, than getting a ton of attacks in, because if you're not rushing to them, they can't really counterattack you that hard unless they're playing the aggro style. So I think like, it can be tough sometimes, but you can be patient against Polar Dwarfs a little bit and get yourself into a good position rather than feeling like you have to like play their game and counteract all they're trying to do when they set up parapets and stuff. So, one strategy against Polar Dwarves is to, if you can kind of rush in a little bit and try to get them to set up and get a lot of their gates and parapets back, and then pull back a little bit, that can kind of mess them up. That's kind of the corollary is if they overcommit to a certain position, you can throw them off if you pull back from that strategy and attack them from a different angle. And again, they'll just waste, if they have a gate, a parapet, and an ice golem on one side of the board, and then you just shift over to the other side. It's like wasted assets for them on that side of the board. So that's a nice way you can kind of counteract what they're trying to do. And sometimes I think newer players don't think as much about position. They just think about how do I maximize my attacks on all these big commons and units and structures.
Yeah, I know a mistake that I made early on a couple of times playing against them was I would be up in towards like the middle of the battlefield with my summoner, and I'd try and block a gate with my summoner to protect like a lower health summoner, and then Savara would just shift the gate to the side, and I'd just get slammed by Nadiana, or I know Snaug killed me a couple times that way. He'd just shift the gate to the side, and then I'd just get slaughtered by Nadiana.
No, you're right. That it's so ingrained with so almost every other matchup. When you see the gate, you want to block the summoning spot, and sometimes you just have to unprogram that against Polar Dwarves because you're like, you can move that or summon from so many other places. So fighting that natural instinct to block summoning spots, you just have to view it differently against Polar Dwarves.
Maybe we could move on to like talking about your experiences playing in live tournaments as well as doing well in the league.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the competitive aspect I've enjoyed a lot about the game. I mean, I think in general, I tend to be just kind of a competitive person, but maybe it's less the kind of in your face, like I'm like full of testosterone and screaming at people, more of just like I like a challenge. Like, and if like even like in some of the athletic things I've done in my life, if there's not like a challenge associated with it, I'm less inclined to go after it, or the more there's a challenge associated with, I think that energizes me or encourages me to put more into it. So I've really appreciated the fact that there's in the leagues out there, just because I like playing for fun. Don't get me wrong. I like just random games, but when there's a league game, especially early on, it was like, ooh, how deep can I go? How much can I think about this? And so there was some messages on the Discord server earlier, like I think last week about some of this, but I think especially early on, I really use the league matches to think, okay, not only do I just want to think about like the tactics and maybe how I want to approach the matchup, but how can I start anticipating what my opponent's going to do and think a few turns ahead and start understanding like some of the tendencies of opponents. And there was a period of time where I really just enjoyed that, like trying to go deeper and keep thinking about, okay, well, if I do whiff here, how would I recover and so I think like that part of it for a while was really enjoyable. There was a point where it can be a lot, and if you overcommit to that, or that you feel like you have to do that, and then it starts sucking a bit of the joy out of the game. And so I think that's just something that I've had to put into balance a little bit more, knowing that, hey, there's a time for that. I've got 3 girls, I've got like a professional life too, and like knowing how to keep all that balance is something that it's become important. So I still like participate in the league, and I think I've notably just had to change my perspective towards, hey, I'll give it, I'll still, give it my best, but there are some weeks where I just have to play and take the turns, and maybe there's some other weeks where I have a little time I can spend a bit more thought on turns, and if that means I don't win or I get demoted in the league, that's okay. Like I'm not as like, I don't think I'm quite as caught up in that as maybe I was, where earlier on in the first few seasons, like, man, you'd like put all this effort in, and then you just like whiff on a turn, and it was like, it would bother me for a while. I'm like, man, like, the dice would have much more of an effect, where I think now I'm able to kind of just keep it all in perspective. Like dice are going to dice, you just, you got to roll with it and just like understand that's part of the game. And like, I think I'm in a good spot with the league where I'm going to keep going the foreseeable future, just because I've gotten more okay with, or sometimes I'll lose, and because I don't have the time, or I'm not in a place where I feel like really putting in all this extra effort to kind of analyze, and that's okay. I think that's with competitive play where I've kind of landed. And tournaments, I like the official tournaments. I think they're fun, and I think I like just, I try to pick factions that I'm enjoying playing at the time, and don't try to pick like the the top of the top. Maybe I got to start going more Snaug style and pick like the the lowest tier and just have see how far I can get. But usually I'm just picking factions I enjoy. So, but I think it's a fun like outlet just to kind of get a big group and see how it goes and have some more structure to it. And then I think in person, as I mentioned, I've got 3 young girls, so a lot of the games played around my house are like exploding kittens and like have to do with princesses or kittens. So like I'm not playing a ton of
Have you played Boop?
I haven't played Boop. What's Boop?
Boop is like a 2-player abstract where you have all these cats on a board and they push each other around, and you're trying to push them off the bed essentially. And then if you get 3 in a row, you get 3 bigger cats, and then the way you win is if you get 3 big cats in a row.
Hey, I gotta write that down.
It's a very neat little abstract. I think you probably get it like at like a Barnes and Noble kind of store, like that kind of like more mainstream kind of store. But yeah, my girlfriend found out about it on like TikTok, I think, or something. I don't know. It was fun. It's a fun little abstract called Boop, and you just mentioning cats and kittens made me think that would be one you might take a look at. The only thing is, if you got 3 girls, only 2 people can play at once. So if it gets popular,
Might need 2 copies.
And truth be told, my 10-year-old, she's I tried Summoner Wars with her like a few years ago, and it didn't take as much. But a couple weeks ago, I got the board out again, and I think she enjoyed it more. Like I think she's at the age where it's intriguing her a little bit more. So again, you never know. Maybe my daughter will come onto the scene sometime. But
I had a funny moment with our 7-year-old girl. She was looking at over my shoulder, and she's like, "You have no gates. Is that bad?" I was like, "We've never played the game," but she just knew. And then I did lose that game. I did lose that game for having no gates.
that is funny. Yeah. We get the the backseat driver. I can't wait for that.
Man, I think most of us are gonna flee in terror when the Orange Lazarus training community gets all your kids in the leagues and the competitive. And
My oldest, who's 10, she's like she's a thinker. She like loves to like think about things, and like analyze things. So I think like she could be pretty good. My middle daughter, who's 8, she has no patience for that. She's like very very like kind of social and low attention span. Then my 5-year-old, man, she's got the killer instinct. She could be the
The
ringer.
best one.
She doesn't like to lose. If she doesn't know something, she's gonna figure it out. Like she's the one that someday, watch out for her when she comes up. So
Someone Wars 3rd edition.
yes, be unstoppable. But in person, it is fun, and I think that was part of quite like
Yeah.
Gen Con has been like I never went to Gen Con before Summoner Wars, but just I went a couple years, and I just like the one year I had a bunch of air miles that from business that I was like I'm gonna fly out, play in a tournament, and just fly back the same day, and I did, and it was fun, and I won the tournament. I mean, it was
So you paid for your ticket.
I did, so that worked out beautifully.
You can go out for one day. That's so awesome.
Yeah, I did. This past year I went with my brother, and this past year I had a lot more fun because I went with my brother. We got to try a lot of games, like demo stuff, but also met up with like some people from the community, like Ben, Backcountry Gamer was there. A few other a few other people were there in the tournament that I didn't hang out with as much outside of the tournament, but like just meeting people. We Ben showed us a few games. We like trialed a few games. Like he had a friend there. Like it was a lot of fun to just kind of get some of that in-person time and try out some games and more just in a very casual, fun way. And so even though I didn't win this last tournament, it was by far my favorite experience just going out, having some in-person games, watching other people play, talking about stuff, but even doing non-Summoner War stuff was really cool. So I'm an advocate. I'd love to see more people get out there when they can. Our community's, I think, pretty cool. Like the Discord community is great. You got people you guys are doing this. You got Ben and Fuzzy doing their the scuffles. Like there's a lot of good stuff going on, but it's hard to replace meeting someone in person and just like making that connection, which I really enjoyed this past year.
yeah, I almost did the same thing that first year that they were doing second edition tournaments at Gen Con. I live like I want to say like 5.5 hours from Indy, and I almost drove down. I was like, I'll do it all in one day. I'll drive down for the tournament, and then I'll just drive back. And I was like, 10 hours of driving. I No, I really wanted to because I love the in-person like tournaments and just like getting to see everybody and hang out. And I playing in Summoner Wars tournaments in person, I feel like it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, I found out that Ben lived near me, and I've met him a couple times to play. We'd like to get a live scene going in the Chicago area, but who knows? But that's like our pipe dream. Is finding a store to back us up so that we don't have to do all the organizing and just kind of like, or like a good place to come, and have space. But yeah.
I got a cousin in Chicago. Yeah, let me know. Maybe I'll burn some more air miles up and get out there. So
I know a lot of the talk in the community recently has been about like burnout with like the competitive scene. Why don't you talk just a little bit about that and like how you've been able to just avoid that so far? Because a lot of the top players, either for getting too busy or getting overwhelmed with how much pressure and like time consuming the competitive scene can take, from the league to the tournaments to the like homegrown tournaments, community tournaments. There's just a lot always going on.
there is, and for me, I think the biggest adjustment has been just reminding myself that the goal is to enjoy the game. The goal is not necessarily to like win every match. But for me, I just think sometimes it like I get absorbed in it and want to play my best. And wow, if I didn't, am I leaving something on the table if I didn't do this or think? And I've gotten to a better place of saying the goal is to enjoy it. This is no one's gonna like make a living playing Summoner Wars or. And so I think like I've just kind of recalibrated that a bit, and that's been helpful. And I think for me, actually, one of the turning points, you guys maybe remember this too. I think it was like season 8 or 9, where I think like Donkey had won 2 of the leagues, I had won 2, and I was in the final again with him. And it was actually with Polar Dwarves. I had Svara. I had like just had to take. He had 1 health on his summoner. I think it was Takulu. And I went 0 for 3, and I ended up losing. I lost the league because I whiffed, and because he came back and won that game. And I was like, "Is this worth it? Like, what am I doing?" Like I had one of these moments, like, "What? I just like lost the league on this, 0 for 3." But then, I think like shortly thereafter, I was like, you know what? I just have to focus on enjoying it and know that sometimes it's going to go my way and other times it's not. And even if it doesn't, it's still a great community. It's still a great game. There's enjoyment to be had just by playing, not necessarily by winning. So yeah, that's kind of where I've landed more. That's helped me.
Where I've tried to land with like those one life games is like, oh, I was so close. But like, 1, think about how relieved the other person is. Like, oh, I got a second chance. And 2, just like appreciate that the game was close and that like, that's probably the ideal situation, is to have like a good close game and not a stomp one way or the other.
It does help too, like to, like this podcast or meeting people at Gen Con, when you humanize other people and they're not like just some like faceless foe that you're, even Donkey, I did like one of our tournament finals or league finals, we did like a dual commentary on, and just like stuff like that. You're like, hey, this is a good person. I don't mind losing to this person versus some enemy or opponent that has less of a face or a name. So I've been able to kind of balance that. But I get it. Like I think Vexer made some like, comments in the Discord where it's like consuming a lot of his day, where he's thinking about it and it's interrupting him. And I get it. Like if it can be hard to kind of turn that off if you're in that mode and playing like in a tournament. And it's funny, there was a period of time in the early where I wanted to be with my family at night. I didn't want to be like looking at like an iPad or my computer. So I'd like print out the board on a piece of paper, and my girls would be doing their stuff, and I'd like be looking at this piece of paper and just like, but at least I'd be like down there. But I'm like, you know what? I just need to dial this back a little bit, because I don't need to be like staring at, paper in the, in the evening. So
I think that Donkey has plenty of trophies and could have shared that one with you. I think it would have been all right if he would have shared that one. I petitioned him sometimes to share some of his trophies.
His discipline is to the maximum, because I think like key thing with competitive play, I feel like, is often the splashiest move where you can get the most attack or do the most like unique thing isn't necessarily always the best move, because the best move is often the one that a few turns from now is going to pay off, or is going to position you better to counterattack, or is going to force your opponent to do something. But it's often not quite as fun to play that way, because you just want to go for like the big attack or the cool move, where Donkey was just so disciplined, would do the most boring moves, but it was the right move, and he never deviated from that, like this robotic discipline. And like I think Vexor, I feel like's got some of that too. So it would have been fun to see them play against each other. But with Donkey, I found my secret to like being most competitive against Donkey is if you built up a lot of magic, because I think he was really good at analyzing what you were going to do based on what your hand was, what your position was. Like he would anticipate what you were going to do. But if you build up a lot of magic, there were just too many options. It's almost like it couldn't compute. Like his AI brain wasn't big enough.
So get to 10 magic.
He would like then have to account for the most crazy situations, and it would throw him off, it felt like sometimes. So I started like doing crazier stuff like that where I'd get up to them. Even if I didn't have Gul'dun, I'd like build enough magic so he thought I would, and then he'd play as if I had Gul'dun. And like that, for him, I think was his maybe his Achilles heel, versus if you only had like 3 magic, he'd think of everything you could do with 3 magic and play around it. And that was like just hard to do much with. But maybe if he ever comes back, that's, there's a little tip.
Yeah, I know in our recent league game we had together where you were the High Elves and I was the Breakers, you had like 8-10 magic for like a majority of like the later part of the game. I don't know what he's going to do with all that. Never even saw a champ. Like you never even got a champ out until like Albus at the end, and you didn't use most of your magic, but I was just thinking about it a whole lot.
In that particular case, it's because all my champs were at the end, and I couldn't. I was like, I feel like I want to get those champs out, given where the game was, and I couldn't.
Yeah, it's so tough. It's like, I want to use Cassia and get value, and you just don't draw her,
We appreciate you coming on, Orange Lazarus, and coming and hanging out with us and talking Polar Dwarves. I'm sure we'll have you on for another faction at some point.
Oh, hey, I appreciate it, guys. Keep doing what you're doing. It's I'm a fan. I listen in. It's enjoyable to hear other people's perspectives. So appreciate you guys, and thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Discard for Magic. We appreciate everybody listening, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.